A lot in that text. I'm going to focus on one thought here in just a moment as it relates to that history about Lazarus in that text. I drove over to Sam and Hannah's Friday and spent the day with him yesterday, and anyway, had an interesting experience with him yesterday. But I was driving home last night and from Washington D.C. back home, and I was going. Anybody traveled that way? Ever go through Paw Paw? Anybody been in Paw Paw? Once in a while I'll take that route. But as I was coming home, I kept asking myself, "Am I doing this right?" Google was telling me I was right. Maps was working that way. Everything seemed okay. But I just at times had doubts. Is this the same road I've been on before? Are these the same places that I'd traveled before? But then once in a while, there would be a reminder. When you get into Paw Paw itself, it reminds you, oh yeah, this is that little town that I've been through before. When you pass the peach stand along the road, right? The farmer's market, the various things that you encounter, those things remind you of things that you knew prior, and they help reconvince you that you're doing the right thing. I share that with you to simply illustrate what I want to share with you this morning, but only on a more serious matter. The truth is, all of us, now maybe that sounds judgmental, most of us at least, and probably all of us who have walked our walks of faith at some point in time have wondered, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Am I really honoring God in my life? And sometimes we have to take consideration of the things that we're doing, and in some ways have to be reconvinced, if you will, that yes, my spiritual decisions have value. The choices that I'm making and have made as it relates to serving the Lord, those are important to me, and they bring priority and benefit to my life. And so we reconvince ourselves, as need be from time to time, that our faith has value and that following God is the most virtuous thing that I could ever do in this life. And so this morning, let me just share with you some ways that we can slowly but surely maybe reconvince or convince ourselves that our service to God is beneficial. And I want to start by simply acknowledging the fact that some will never be convinced. There was concern, right, in that text that Todd read for us out of John chapter 11, that the raising of Lazarus was going to cause a problem for the Jews. Because they knew that as soon as people heard that carpenter's son, that teacher that has these handful of disciples that have been following around in these different places, has now done something that no one can even begin to try to even con their way into happening. Everybody knew Lazarus was dead. Everybody knew he'd been placed in that tomb. Everybody knew that he was actually in there long enough for the death process that happens afterwards to begin to occur. Everybody understood the realities of the circumstance of Lazarus. Nobody wanted that stone rolled away because of what they feared they would find. But Jesus has them roll that stone away, and He says the words, "Lazarus, come forth," and out comes a living, breathing Lazarus. And from that point forward, everybody who encounters Jesus has an issue to deal with. They either have to deny His power, though everybody witnessed it in the raising of Lazarus, or they have to commit themselves to it and let it become meaningful to them. And you would think that something as powerful and as meaningful as the resurrection of a life that everybody knew had been deceased would be powerful enough to convince everybody that they ought to believe in Jesus. But it didn't. To those in power and rule among the Jews, what it convinced them of was Jesus has to die. We can't lose the nation. We can't lose the prominence that we have. We can't lose the authority that we have over the people. We can't lose the position of power that we've gained. We can't give any of that up. The nation has to survive. One man has to die. That's what we just read out of John chapter 11. after they had witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus, they're convinced more so, not that they should be believers in Jesus, but they're more convinced that they can't have Jesus walking around anymore, demonstrating this kind of power. In fact, jump to chapter 12 with me for a moment, and I've used this text with you before to illustrate an interesting aspect of the Pharisees. But not only were they committed to the idea and convinced that no, we shouldn't be believers in Jesus, what we should do, well, let me backtrack. I think they couldn't deny in some ways what He had been doing. They didn't want to become followers of Jesus. And so much so that they were even concerned that Lazarus, the great living and breathing example of Jesus' power, that he shouldn't live anymore either. Verse 10 of chapter 12, the chief priest plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. Even though there are witnesses to the tremendous power and benefit that Jesus could bring, there are some who won't be convinced no matter what, in some senses. And I say that not to be disheartening. I say that not to discourage or even in some ways I don't want it to be a thought where I say, well, I'm not going to talk about Jesus anymore because they're not going to be convinced anyway. That's not my intent here. But I do want you and I to appreciate that there were those who were witnesses to the power of Jesus and still weren't convinced that they should become His disciples. And it shouldn't be a surprise or a shock to us that that still happens. There are going to be people who simply just refuse to be convinced that they should do anything as it relates to Jesus. And that's disheartening, it's sad, it's disappointing, it's discouraging, it's all of the above. But it's reality. Not everybody desires to be a follower of Jesus. I think of that rich man in Luke chapter 16. And I think about his concluding thoughts. And this is, you think about the sadness of this. But notice, he wants, right, he tells Abraham in this picture, send somebody back. If one would go back from the dead, then my brothers will listen, right? My brothers will be convinced that they need to be doing something to keep themselves out of this torment that I am in. Verse 33, but he said to him, Abraham speaking, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. By the way, Jesus knew that was going to be true, right? Jesus understood the truth of that reality, that even bringing somebody back to life from the dead would not be enough to convince some people. Some people weren't convinced when Lazarus walked out of that tomb. Some people weren't convinced, though an entire populace witnessed the death of Jesus. They witnessed Him placed on a cross. They witnessed Him hanging there at Calvary. They witnessed the side being pierced. They had every evidence in the world that He was dead. And then there's an empty tomb. But it still didn't convince everyone. But that's not really who I'm talking about this morning. Watch it waste our 10 minutes, Brian. Well, to illustrate to you that not everybody gets, but that's not really who I'm talking about this morning. That's troublesome, right? Those folks are, if you won't even give credence to one being raised from the dead, I don't know what will move you, right? Some are in that camp. But some of us aren't necessarily in that camp, like Agrippa, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Some have been persuaded, but there have been distractions. Some have been convinced, but something is challenging that faith. Something's interrupting that growth process. Something is disturbing that effort to be a disciple and a follower of Jesus. That's the audience I'm speaking to today. That's who I want to encourage today. to be willing to accept the fact that sometimes all of us have to be reconvinced. Sometimes all of us have to kind of get back to the basics, if you will. We've got to get back to some foundational thing that led us to Jesus to begin with, that will allow us to reestablish our convictions and our faith in our relationship to Jesus. So just notice a handful of texts with me that illustrate what I'm talking about. Notice Acts chapter 13. In Acts chapter 13, in verse 43. Notice what the work of the Apostle Paul and Barnabas was purposed here. When the congregation had broken up, it says, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, and speaking to them, persuaded them. Now I want you to notice this. They persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. My point, friends, is simply this. Paul and Barnabas recognized a need to persuade and convince and reconvince people that grace was not something to just simply be received in the moment. Grace was something they should continue in. Maybe that's part of our challenge at times. We viewed the grace of God as a moment in time. I honored God's commands. I fulfilled and obeyed the gospel. I was baptized into Christ. However definition we want to place on that. But then we've got this mindset, well, that's the moment that I received grace, and there's an element of truth to that. But grace isn't something that I just simply receive in a moment in time. Grace is something that I receive and then I continue in it. And Paul and Barnabas recognized that some folks would need persuaded, that's the word, that some folks would need to be persuaded to continue in that. I am interested in you starting to become a disciple, a follower, an imitator of Jesus. I am also just as committed to encouraging you to be a continual follower, imitator, disciple of Jesus. I want you to understand and appreciate the beauty of God's grace and the forgiveness that comes through the power of the blood of the Lamb. But I also want you and I to recognize the benefit and beauty of continuing steadfast in that relationship. Don't think of grace as a one-time moment. Think of grace as something that I live in every day. Think of grace as something that I continue in. And sometimes I might have to pause and rethink and reevaluate and remind myself of that moment when I first understood and appreciated and received the grace of God, and how I need to be continually persuaded and exhorted to remain in that grace. And I would simply argue, by the way, that persuasion is important, and to recognize that grace isn't something that we just receive and then it's permanently implanted in us. I appreciate what Paul and Barnabas are teaching us there, that grace was something that they had to be persuaded to continue in. You don't do that if grace could never leave, right? Paul and Barnabas are wasting their breath. If grace is something that you receive and then it never leaves you, then why are they trying to persuade them to continue in it if they couldn't leave it if they wanted to? My point is, sometimes we've got to be reconvinced and repersuaded and reminded and encouraged, and that happens every day of our lives sometimes. Because it's absolutely possible for me to leave the grace that God has extended. If you're back in Acts chapter 11, verse 23, when he came and had seen the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all that with purpose of heart they should continue with the Lord. That they should cleave unto the Lord. That they should stay steadfast. Friends, I'm simply trying to invite all of us this morning to appreciate the importance of reminding ourselves regularly that I need to stay steadfast and continue in the grace and promises of God. And maybe I'm also trying to encourage us to realize that's okay. It's okay that I needed reminded. Right? Everybody needs reminded sometimes. Everyone needs to be given a reminder of where those hitching posts are, things that we can connect to and remind ourselves. It's that you haven't failed, right? You haven't completely and utterly failed Jesus. Because I've got a doubt, I've got a question, I've got something that I need to reevaluate and reconsider and reaffirm in my mind. You haven't failed. You're going through what the apostles said many would go through. You're going through what the apostles said lots of folks would have to be reminded of and continued steadfastly reminded. I don't want you to become discouraged because you had a doubt or you wondered or you were... I invite you to resolve it. I invite you to get back to maybe what brought you to faith to begin with that might encourage and help us to cleave unto the Lord again. I invite you to make sure that you're making every effort to continue in the grace of God. But don't view yourself as an utter failure because I had to be reminded. I think I'm an okay driver. I didn't fail yesterday because I couldn't remember whether that was the right road or not. I needed reminded. It didn't make me any better or worse. It just was part of... Sometimes in our walk of faith, it's part of it. To have to be reminded and encouraged, to cleave again, to renew again, to remind again, to stay steadfast. I think about what Paul wrote to those in Rome in Romans chapter 8. It's an interesting text. It's got a lot of nuance to it. But I want you to think about it in relationship to our discussion this morning. It's a familiar passage, right? Verse 28 of Romans chapter 8. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God. To those who are called according to His purpose. You know, sometimes I have to remind myself what this is all about. We've been doing our study in our Bible class time about worship. I come to worship, why? Because I love God. I want to express that love of God. I appreciate how God works in my life, and He can take the sum total of my life and ultimately make that sum total work for good. By the way, there's no implication in this text that I can find that He said that every single thing that happens to you in life will be good. That's not what He said. He said He can take the sum total of all things that occur, all of that can work to the benefit and good of our life if we'll remind ourselves of the love of God that has been expressed to me and has been shared with me and has been encouraging me. I'm just trying to help us make application, but have you ever wondered, does God really love me? Have you ever wondered how could God love me? How could God love me? I'm pitiful, sinful. I have to have grieved the Lord on multiple occasions. How could God love me in such a state? And yet Jesus reminds us repeatedly that He came to seek and to save that which was lost. Jesus reminds us that He came to die not just for those who were already loving Him, but for those who needed to learn to love Him, who were enemies of His. Friends, the love of God sometimes is available. We miss out on it on occasion. We step away from it on occasion. We don't get to experience it like we should because we've decided for some reason that God couldn't love me. And I've got to reconvince myself and remind myself that Jesus died so that He could love me. Jesus died and forgave me and cleansed me of my sins because He wants to love me. And bring me into reconciliation with Him. Don't forget that. Remind yourself regularly of what God has done so that He can express that love to each and every one of us. At times we've got to be reminded of it. Sometimes we've got to remind ourselves of what God can really do. The Bible sometimes tells us very specifically what God is doing. Sometimes the Bible tells us what God can do. We don't always know what God is fulfilling at times. But sometimes we need to just remind ourselves and be reconvinced that God's power is real. And be convinced of it. Verse 12 of 2 Timothy chapter 1. For this reason I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. I may be going through a lot in my life. And those things in my life may be trying to persuade me, those worldly things, those earthly thought processes, those temporal challenges. They may be trying to educate and teach and lead me from thinking, well, why stay connected to God through all this? And Paul writes to Timothy here and he says, remember, I've suffered through a lot. But I'm not ashamed of any of the things that I've suffered for the cause of Christ. Why? For I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that He is able to keep what I have committed to Him until that day. Why did he stay steadfast? Why could he suffer through those challenges? Because he never lost faith in the promises. Friends, when you feel discouraged and disheartened, and when you feel like that the world is getting the best of you, reconfirm your commitment and belief in the promises of God. And the promises of God have fully been intended to bring eternal benefit. We become so focused on the present that we often convince ourselves, well, God's not doing anything. Look at this circumstance that I'm in. And we often forget that God's focus and purpose and primary reason for sending Jesus was to lead souls to His heavenly home. And though I suffer and am challenged and have conflicts and things that distract and discourage, I will not be persuaded away, Paul says, in whom I have believed and put my faith and confidence. Friends, get up every day, and no matter what that day brings to you, simply remind yourself that someday I'll sit with the Father on high. No matter what this day is offering to me, and no matter what challenge it's happened to be presenting in this moment, someday I will stand before the Father. Someday I will sit around the throne and sing, "Worthy is the Lamb." This is the temporary state that I am in, the greater conditions to come. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of the great power of God and the power of His promises. And in that process, sometimes we have to be reminded to just simply do what's right. And let God address and remind and reconvince me when needed. Just notice a couple of illustrations here. Verse 5 of chapter 14 of Romans. One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. There's a very particular application here, I get it, but I want you to see the way to resolve it was get convinced, right? Let God lead you to the conviction that He wants you to have. Verse 14, same passage. I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. I know that's a specific topic, not what we're talking about directly this morning. I'm simply illustrating to you that when they were trying to understand what's right, what is wrong, how should I behave, what should I do about these feast days, how should I respond to these challenges, he says, get convinced in what the Lord would want from you. That was how they could resolve it. Friends, when you've got your questions, it's okay. When you've got things you're trying to resolve, that's okay. All of us do. But let the Lord be the source that leads you to the conviction. See, that's the challenge, right? When we're trying to reconvince ourselves, when we're trying to recommit ourselves, the challenge comes because we're doing that sometimes from every other source but Jesus. And the next thing you know, I'm not convinced at all. When you're striving to build your faith and build your commitment and build your relationship to the Father and to the Son. And yes, in those moments where we need to be reconvinced and recommitted, don't worry about what Joe, Sam, Harvey, and Fred say over here. Concern yourself with what the Lord has said. Let the Lord be the convincing factor. Not the thoughts of men, not the beliefs of men, not the... When you really want to be reconvinced and recommitted and build that faith in greater and stronger ways again, get your mind, your eyes, your thoughts, your heart focused on what has the Lord actually said. Because that's where the real conviction and the real convincing will occur. It's okay to need to be reconvinced from time to time. It's okay. It happens. Quite frankly, the scariest place of all in this conversation today would be go back to the beginning of our study and be like that rich man who has brothers that wouldn't even be convinced if one came back from the dead because they've already been ignoring the law of Moses. Or like those Pharisees who were fully knowledgeable of what had happened with Lazarus, but weren't convinced at all that should lead them to discipleship of Jesus. That's a scary place to be. But to have a question, something you need to resolve, a need to be reconvinced of the purpose of faith, that those are common to all of us who strive to honor the Savior. The question simply remains, will I let the Lord lead me back to Him? Will I let the Savior be the one who's convincing me and leading me to recommit myself unto Him? Maybe today I need to start that process. Maybe today I need to step into those promises. And this needs to be the beginning moment of that. And we could help you do that today. We'd encourage you to think about it. To find remission of sins in the blood of the Lamb, to have them washed away through baptism. If you're prepared for that and understand that and ready for that, we'd be glad to help you. Maybe there's something we can pray for you about today to encourage you to reconvince and reestablish that commitment of faith. And as you've heard me say hundreds of times, maybe I just need to get home and pray before the Father. Lord, I'm off track. Help me get back on track. I love you. I love your Son. I want to be a disciple. Guide me, help me, become convinced again of what I need to do what's right in your eyes. But if there's something we could help you with this morning, encourage you in, strengthen you in, then we invite you to think about it in this moment. And if we could aid you in some way, won't you come